The snow had stopped falling by morning, but the town did not look like it had survived a storm. It looked like it had been erased. Woodsheds that had stood for years were gone, flattened under drifts taller than a man on horseback. Families were digging through collapsed roofs with bare hands, searching for logs that had been buried since the first night of the blizzard. Somewhere near the church, a woman was crying, not for a person, but for a stack of firewood she would never reach in time. And in the middle of all that ruin, one house had smoke rising steady from its chimney. Not a struggling fire, not a rationed flame. A full, warm, unbothered column of smoke, as if the storm outside had never happened at all. Neighbors stood at the edge of that property and stared at something that made no sense to them. There was no woodshed standing on that land. There had never been one, not since the fall. And yet somehow, the one man in the entire valley who should have run out of fuel first was the only one who had not run out at all. Weeks earlier, people had laughed at what he was doing to his own floor. Some had called it foolish. One neighbor had called it dangerous. A man who dug into the ground beneath his own home, they said, was a man asking for trouble he could not see coming. He said nothing back. He kept digging. What he buried under that floor was not treasure, and it was not a secret room. It was something far more ordinary and far more strange than anyone expected. And the reason it worked had nothing to do with luck. It had to do with something the ground had been doing, quietly, the entire time. If you are watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where you are in the comments. Stories like this survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if this kind of frontier wisdom matters to you, subscribing helps keep it alive. The year before, Niels Halverson had built his woodshed the way every man in the valley built one. 4 posts, a slanted roof, walls thick enough to keep out wind, but never meant to keep out weight. He had filled it with 2 full seasons of cut pine and birch, enough, he believed, to carry his small family through until the thaw. He was wrong, and the wrongness arrived quietly. It was not the cold that broke him that winter. It was the snow itself, patient and enormous, piling against the shed's low roof night after night until the beams gave way without warning, in the dark, while the wind was already too loud to hear the crack of splitting wood. By morning, the shed had folded in on itself like a closed hand, and every log inside it was buried under snow that had turned to ice at its edges. His son, Anders, was 6 years old that winter, and Niels remembered exactly how his boy's breath looked in the cabin air 2 mornings later, when the last of the split kindling ran out and the fire shrank to something that could no longer be called warmth. He remembered wrapping the child in every blanket they owned and still hearing him cough through the night. They survived that winter. A neighbor brought wood he could not spare, and the debt of it sat on Niels in a way no money ever had. His own father, back in the old country, had lost a farm the same way, not to a single storm, but to the slow arithmetic of being unprepared when preparation mattered most. Niels had crossed an ocean partly to escape that story. Now he was living inside it. By the time the snow melted that spring, he had already decided something would change. He did not yet know what. He only knew that a shed standing above the ground, exposed to every drift the sky could build, was not a solution he trusted anymore. He began walking the perimeter of his own cabin in the evenings, saying nothing to anyone, looking at the ground the way another man might look at a doorway he had never noticed before. By late summer, Niels had made a decision that he did not explain to his neighbors, mostly because he suspected they would try to talk him out of it. Instead of rebuilding a woodshed above the ground, he began digging beneath the floor of his own cabin. It started small enough that no one noticed. A loosened floorboard here, a widened gap there. Within 2 weeks, there was a hole beneath his home, large enough for a grown man to stand inside, and dirt piled at the edge of his property that had no obvious purpose to anyone passing by. The town's assumptions filled in the blanks the way assumptions usually do. Some believed he was building a root cellar for potatoes and turnips, which made sense to them, since half the families in the valley kept something similar. Others whispered that a grieving widower digging alone under his own house at odd hours was doing something stranger than vegetable storage, though none of them said so to his face. Anders, too young to understand caution, thought it was the most interesting thing his father had ever done. He would sit at the edge of the hole with a lantern, asking whether they were building a cave, and Niels would answer only that they were building somewhere the wood would be safe. He measured the depth with an old wooden stick, the same one his father had once used to mark snowfall back home, now repurposed to mark the depth of soil instead of the depth of drifts. 4 feet, then 5. He wanted to go below the point where he believed the ground stayed the same temperature all winter, though he could not have explained the reason in scientific terms. He knew it only the way a blacksmith knows metal, through years of paying attention to something other men walked past without seeing. What he did not yet know was that digging the hole was the easy part. Making it survive its first frost was another matter entirely, and the first person to tell him so would not be gentle about it. The warning came from Halvard Cruz, a rancher who had worked that valley for 20 years longer than Niels had lived in it, and who had buried more failed ideas of his own than most men cared to admit. Halvard found Niels standing waist-deep in his own excavation on a cool September afternoon, and he did not bother with pleasantries. "Wood needs to breathe," he said, "same as a man in a coat too tight. Bury it in a hole with no air moving through, and it will not freeze. It will rot." He had lost half a season once storing lumber against a damp cellar wall, thinking the walls would protect it, only to find it soft enough to press a thumb through by spring. It was not cruelty, it was experience, and Niels knew the difference, which was exactly why the warning stayed with him longer than any mockery would have. He had already noticed, standing in that half-dug pit, that the air near the bottom felt different from the air near the opening. Heavier somehow, carrying a faint mineral dampness that reminded him of the inside of a well. He said nothing to Halvard about it, mostly because he did not yet have an answer, only a growing unease that the rancher might be right. That night, Anders asked whether the wood cave would work, and Niels gave him an answer he did not entirely believe himself. "We will see what the ground tells us," he said. He returned to the site alone before sunrise, running a hand along the packed earth walls, feeling for the places where moisture gathered instead of drying, trying to understand something that no one in the valley had bothered to solve before him, because no one else had been foolish enough, or desperate enough, to try storing firewood below their own floor in the first place. Through the final weeks of September, the cabin above the hole stayed the same, but the ground beneath it became something else entirely. Niels reinforced the walls of the pit with flat stones gathered from the creek bed and packed clay mixed with straw, a method he had watched an old stonemason use years earlier for a different purpose and never expected to need for this one. He built a narrow set of wooden steps down from a trapdoor cut into his cabin floor, close enough to the stove that he could reach it without stepping outside into the cold. The chamber itself was roughly 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, just tall enough for a grown man to stand without stooping, with walls that felt cool and solid rather than damp, at least on the days when the weather stayed dry. He stacked the first cords of split birch along one wall, leaving gaps between the rows the way he stacked wood above ground, though he was not yet certain the same logic applied underground. Anders helped carry smaller pieces down the steps, proud of a job that felt important, even though he did not fully understand why his father had chosen to hide their firewood beneath the house instead of beside it. For a few days, everything seemed settled. The chamber held its temperature. The wood stayed dry to the touch. Niels allowed himself the smallest measure of relief, the kind a man allows himself only once, before the world reminds him that a good idea and a working idea are not always the same thing. It was Anders who noticed it first, on a morning about a week later, wrinkling his nose at a smell in the cabin that had not been there before. Something faint, earthy, and a little too much like the inside of a well that had gone untouched too long. Niels lifted the trap door and looked down into the chamber, and for the first time since he had started digging, he felt something closer to fear than determination. The chamber beneath the cabin had held its promise for exactly 8 days. By the 9th morning, Niels climbed down the narrow steps and found the birch logs on the lowest tier sitting in a faint sheen of moisture, the kind that did not come from rain, since no rain had fallen, but from something rising quietly out of the earth itself and settling on whatever it touched. He pressed his thumb against the bark of one log and felt it give slightly. Not rotten yet, but no longer the dry, resistant wood he had stacked there over a week earlier. That night, Anders coughed through most of his sleep, a dry catching sound that pulled Niels out of bed twice to check on him. In the morning, the boy's eyes looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with normal childhood restlessness, and Niels found himself standing at the open trap door, staring down into the dark chamber, hearing Halvard Cruz's warning again in his own memory. Wood needs to breathe, same as a man in a coat too tight. He had built a hole in the ground and filled it with fuel, and now the hole was doing exactly what a sealed hole in the ground will always do. It was holding on to moisture that had nowhere else to go, and that moisture was settling into both the wood and the air his son was breathing 2 floors above it. For a full day, Niels considered abandoning the project entirely. He thought about filling the chamber back in, admitting the idea had been a mistake, and facing another winter with an ordinary shed built the ordinary way, whatever the risk of another collapse. Pride was not what stopped him. Anders was. If the chamber below their floor was making the air above it unhealthy, then the answer was not to give up on the chamber. The answer was to understand why the air down there refused to move on its own, and what might convince it to leave. He did not have that answer yet. He only had a boy who coughed at night, a rancher's warning that had turned out to be at least partly true, and a stubborn conviction that the ground itself was not the enemy. Something about the way he had built the chamber was. The answer came from an animal, though Niels did not recognize it as an answer at first. His dog, an aging farm mongrel named Skip, who had outlived 2 owners before Niels, had taken to sleeping in one particular corner of the cabin floor rather than near the stove where every sensible dog usually chose to rest. Niels noticed it only because Anders mentioned it, half joking, asking why Skip preferred the cold corner over the warm one. It was not cold there. Niels knelt down one evening and pressed his palm flat against the floorboards in that corner, and felt something faintly different from the rest of the room, a mildness that did not match the chill coming through the walls elsewhere. That corner sat almost directly above the deepest section of the buried chamber, the part farthest from the trap door and closest to the earth that had never been disturbed by his digging. Niels spent the better part of 2 days after that measuring instead of building, using the same wooden stick his father had once used to mark snowfall, now pushed into different sections of the chamber floor to judge how far down the frost line seemed to sit compared to where the ground stayed steady and mild. He found what he suspected, without fully understanding the reason for it. The deepest, most enclosed part of the chamber held a gentler, more even temperature than the section nearer the trap door, where cold air from the cabin above spilled down and settled without any way to leave. The chamber was not failing because it was underground. It was failing because the air inside it had no path out. He found an old length of stovepipe in the smithy shed behind his cabin, rusted at one end but sound enough to use, and cut a narrow opening near the top of the chamber wall, angling the pipe up through the floor near the corner farthest from the stairs, the same corner where Skip had chosen to sleep. Cold, damp air could now rise and escape through that opening, drawn by the warmth of the cabin above it, while fresh air found its way in through the gaps around the trapdoor steps. The pipe did not create heat. It gave the damp air somewhere to go before it had the chance to settle into the wood or into his son's lungs. Niels could not know whether the fix had worked simply by looking at it, and he was not willing to wait for a full winter storm to find out. What he needed first was a smaller test, and the valley provided one before the month was finished. An early-season storm rolled through in mid-October, dropping close to a foot of wet snow over 2 days. Nothing close to the severity the region would see later, but enough to strain any structure built carelessly. It was the kind of storm that, the previous year, had already begun weakening the joints of his old woodshed long before the true blizzard finished the job in January. This time, Niels and Anders climbed down into the chamber each morning during the storm, checking the wood, checking the air, checking the corner where Skip slept. The logs stayed dry to the touch. The faint, earthy dampness that had worried Niels weeks earlier did not return. Anders, sitting on the bottom step with a lantern in his lap, declared with the confidence only a child can manage that the wood cave had won. Niels was more careful with his optimism. A storm dropping a foot of wet snow across 2 days was not the same as a blizzard that could bury a structure for a week without pause. But something real had shifted. The chamber had held steady air for the first time, and the vent pipe near the corner showed a faint plume of warmer, damp air escaping into the cold whenever he checked it in early morning light. Word of the storm test reached Halvard Cruz before Niels said anything himself. Neighbors passing the property noticed there was no scramble to protect exposed wood, no frantic covering of stacks the way other families rushed to do whenever snow threatened. Halvard came by once more, this time saying less than before, simply asking to see the vent pipe for himself. He did not apologize for his earlier warning, and Niels did not expect him to. Halvard only studied the pipe, ran a hand along the chamber wall, and admitted that he had never thought to let a cellar breathe the way a man lets a stove breathe. It was a small victory, and Niels knew it. The valley had not yet seen what true winter pressure would do to any shelter, however clever. That test was still ahead of them, and when it came, it would not offer 2 gentle days to adjust and correct. It would offer one long, punishing stretch with no mercy for a mistake. The blizzard that arrived in the second week of January was not like the early test in October, and everyone in the valley understood the difference within the first several hours. The wind did not simply blow snow sideways. It built drifts against anything standing still, packing them denser and heavier with each passing hour, until roofs that had survived a decade of ordinary winters groaned under weight they had never been asked to hold before. Word passed from farm to farm by the second day, carried by anyone desperate enough to travel in the whiteout, that woodsheds across the valley were failing one after another. The Ostergaard family lost their entire shed on the second night, the roof folding inward exactly as Niels's own shed had done the year before, burying 2 full seasons of cut wood under snow that would not be reachable again until a thaw came. The widow Pruitt, managing her small farm alone since her husband's death the previous spring, found her modest wood stack collapsed under drift after only a single day, leaving her with barely enough fuel to last through one more night before the situation turned desperate. By the third day, a kind of quiet panic had settled over the community, the sort that comes when people realize the thing they depend on most. Simple heat is no longer guaranteed. Families began combining households, moving children and elderly relatives into whichever homes still had working stoves and fuel enough to share. Halvard Cruz himself, for all his experience and preparation, found his own reserve shed listing dangerously under the accumulated weight, cracking along one support beam in a way that suggested it would not survive a fourth night. Inside Niels's cabin, the trapdoor in the floor stayed exactly as it had during the October test, quietly doing its work without drama. Each morning, Niels climbed down to check the chamber, finding dry wood, steady air, and the faint escaping warmth through the stovepipe vent near the corner where Skip still preferred to sleep. But the storm was not finished testing him yet. On the fourth night, the wind shifted direction entirely, and for the first time since he had built the chamber, Niels heard something change in the sound the vent pipe made. A low, uneven whistle that had not been there before. The whistle from the vent pipe was not loud, but it was wrong, and Niels knew it the moment he heard it change pitch in the middle of the fourth night. He climbed down into the chamber with a lantern held low, moving past the stacked birch that had stayed dry through 3 days of relentless snow, and found the source almost immediately. The wind outside had shifted from the northwest to something closer to due north, and a drift had begun building directly against the outer wall of the cabin, slowly climbing high enough to press against the small opening where the vent pipe let cold, damp air escape into the sky. If the drift climbed much higher, it would seal the pipe completely. Without a path for that air to leave, the chamber would begin collecting moisture again. The same slow, quiet failure that had nearly ruined the wood weeks earlier, except this time there would be no gentle October storm to correct the mistake in. There would only be whatever remained of a January blizzard that showed no sign of weakening. Niels faced a choice that offered no comfortable answer. He could go outside into wind strong enough to steal the breath from a grown man's lungs and try to clear the drift by hand, working blind in the dark with snow moving sideways hard enough to sting exposed skin. Or he could seal the pipe from inside and hope the chamber held its dryness long enough for the storm to pass on its own, gambling his only fuel supply on a storm that had already proven capable of running longer than anyone expected. It was his wife's old wedding quilt, still kept folded near the stove years after her passing, that Niels wrapped around his shoulders before stepping into that wind, not for its warmth, so much as for whatever comfort a familiar object could offer a man about to do something dangerous alone. He was not alone for long. A pounding came at the cabin door only minutes after he stepped back inside from clearing the drift by hand, cold enough that his fingers had stopped answering him properly. It was Halvard Cruz, half buried in snow himself, his own reserve shed having finally collapsed under the accumulated weight an hour earlier, asking, without pride left to spare, whether there was any dry wood in the valley he might buy, borrow, or simply beg for the sake of his family. Niels looked at the man who had warned him, correctly, that wood needed to breathe, and said nothing about the vent pipe or the drift he had just cleared with his own bare hands. He only opened the trap door and told Halvard to bring down as many logs as he could carry. By the time the blizzard finally broke, 5 days after it began, the valley looked less like a community that had survived a storm and more like one that had been quietly rearranged by it. Word of Niels's chamber spread not through boasting, since he had done none, but through Halvard Cruz himself, who told anyone willing to listen that a man he had once warned against digging beneath his own floor had ended up feeding half the valley's stoves during the worst week anyone could remember. The widow Pruitt came by within the month, not to laugh this time, but to ask Niels to walk her own property and help her judge where the ground might hold the same steady mildness his had. What Niels had built was never treated as a secret worth guarding. He walked 3 separate families through the same basic idea before the following autumn arrived, adjusting the depth and the vent placement each time based on the particular slope and soil of their land, since the ground beneath one home was never quite identical to the ground beneath another. Anders grew up watching his father solve that single problem, and it shaped him in a way neither of them fully recognized at the time. Years later, as a grown man helping a young family newly arrived from the old country prepare for their first frontier winter, Anders found himself repeating the same instructions his father had once worked out through trial, failure, and quiet observation, right down to the detail about letting a dog choose its own sleeping spot before deciding where to dig. Local accounts from that stretch of the territory later described that winter as the one that taught the valley to stop building upward and start paying attention to what already existed underground, though the exact number of families who adopted some version of the idea was never precisely recorded. What can be said with more confidence is simpler than any technical explanation. The chamber beneath that cabin floor was never really about wood at all. It was about a father who had already lost too much once, refusing to let the ground beneath his own family go to waste a second time. Niels Halvorsen did not defeat that winter by being stronger than it. He survived it and helped others survive it too by noticing what the earth had been offering the entire time, quietly, to anyone willing to dig deep enough to ask. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.